This video is going to be about the perverts I used to work for. You have to keep in mind that back in the late 60s and 70s, and even in the 80s, the bosses didn't treat their secretaries with much respect, if at all, or even their employees. My first job was in 1967. I was 16 years old, and I worked for a gift shop. My job was to dust off the shelves in the gift shop, where there were hundreds of little trinkets everywhere. But this boss, who I refer to as Toupee Man, because every time he put his head down, you could look up his toupee, was creepy, to say the least. He worked with his wife, but he would bring me into the back room, and he would make me climb the ladder to pick things up from the top shelf. I wore a skirt. That's what we wore back then. We didn't wear pants in those days. So it was on the day that he said to me, "Do your parents know that I stand outside your bedroom window and watch you get dressed?" That was when I decided that I knew I had to have a job because my dad insisted on it, but this was not the job for me. And they allowed me to quit. Nothing was done to this guy because back in those days, it was just like, okay, he's a pervert, just, whatever. But then, 3 years later, I got a job working for an attorney who I heard him in his office talking about me, and he goes, "Yeah, man, you should see my new secretary. She's got legs that go all the way up." And it was like, what is he talking about, But he came to me and he said, "I'm going to ask you out, and I'm going to ask you only once." And keep in mind, he's an attorney. "And if you say no, it's not going to affect your job, but I'm just going to say it once." So, I had a little girl to support, and this was the best paying job I'd ever had. So, of course, I said yes, and I went out with him. And it was very uncomfortable. He was a typical attorney image that you would have. Anyway, we get into this restaurant, and everybody's, I'm not going to say his real name, but we'll say, "Hi, Mr. Jones. Hello, Mr. Jones. Can I do anything for you, Mr. Jones? Do you want anything, Mr. Jones?" You would have thought he was a celebrity. He drove a big white Cadillac, smoked a big fat cigar, and had one client, who I also went out with. But he was a really nice guy. Anyway, that's beside the point. This is for this particular guy. And it got to the point where he said to me that there were jobs that I would have to do for him. One of them was making coffee. I'd never made coffee a day in my life. So that was the first time I learned how to make coffee. But the other one was to go under his desk and perform an activity that I'm not going to mention because I'm pretty sure you can figure it out. And that was what I had to do with that job. Another job he so graciously offered me was to be a prostitute for him. He would pay me $10. He would charge $100, but it was such a good deal, he said, because he was going to provide my wardrobe. He was going to give my daughter the best schools. He would provide food, shelter, clothing for us. So the least he could do, at least I could do for him, was to just take the $10. Of course, back in 1970, this was not, that big a deal, depending on how many guys he was going to have for me. But I was appalled, absolutely appalled. And yeah, that was what contributed to me leaving. There were so many things about that guy, so many things. Anyway, yeah, that. Back in those days, I didn't speak up for myself. And I just let it go. And one day I called my mom and dad, and I was kind of crying and saying, I can't work here anymore. Can I owe you rent for the rest of my life if I have to, if you'd let me leave this job? And again, so I left that job too. And when the year rolled around and I was supposed to get my W-2 forms, he sent me one with the wrong Social Security number. And when I called in, his previous secretary, who went back to work for him, and he told me that she was one who performed his tasks, I said I wanted to get my W-2 form, and she said, well, you're going to have to come in and pick it up. He wants you to come in and get it. Well, I was not going to do that. So I called the Internal Revenue Service and reported him. And they said, oh, it's okay, just, send it in and put your correct Social Security number on it. And so I did. This guy hounded me. He called my sister. He called me all the time. This is back with no cell phones. So I was feeling like I was being stalked a little bit by him. Well, years later, this is after I had 4 kids, a girlfriend and I went down there and I said, you know what? I think I'm finally able to stand up to him. Let's go find him. So we went back into Chicago and looked for him and couldn't find him anywhere. Well, then years later, I discovered that he had moved to California, bought himself an airline, and had a daughter who didn't even use his last name, whose stepfather, she adopted his name, and she is a congresswoman now. So that was my experience with 2 of the perverts that I worked for. So I didn't want to make this too long, because I'm not a long-winded person. That's it. Have a great day.